There is a sound no mother forgets. It is not a cry. It is not laughter. It is the sound of her child's voice cracking in half from shock. I heard that sound on a warm afternoon in the frozen food aisle of a grocery store, and it split my life into two pieces, the life I thought I understood, and the one I was about to be forced into. My name is Claire. I am 36 years old. And for 8 years, I believed I was a widow. I want to tell you this story slowly, the way it happened to me, because if I rush it, you won't feel what I felt. You won't understand how a woman can build an entire life on top of a grave, only to have the ground open up beneath her feet. 8 years ago, I buried my husband, David. Or at least, I buried a casket with his name on it. I stood at that grave in the rain with our 6-month-old son in my arms, and I promised him, in a whisper only the wind could hear, that I would raise our boy to be a good man, just like his father. I want you to understand something before I go further. I was not always this woman, tired, careful, guarded. I used to be soft. I used to believe in easy things, like love lasting forever and people meaning what they say. David and I met in college, in a library of all places, both of us reaching for the same worn copy of a poetry book neither of us actually needed for class. He made me laugh so hard on our first date that I choked on iced tea, and he laughed even harder at that. We married young, maybe too young, but it never felt like a mistake. It felt like coming home to a place I hadn't built yet. He worked in finance, something involving investments and numbers I never fully understood, and I taught second grade at a small elementary school outside the city. We weren't rich, but we were happy, which back then felt like more than enough. When I got pregnant, David cried. Not the quiet, dignified tears men are supposed to have in movies, he sobbed, right there in the bathroom, holding the pregnancy test like it was a piece of the moon. He talked to my belly every night, told our unborn son about the fishing trips they'd take, the treehouse he'd build, the terrible jokes he'd teach him just to annoy me. I remember thinking, this is it. This is the life I get to have. Then, 3 months before Ethan was born, everything about David began to change. He started working later. He said it was stress, a big account, a promotion on the line. He became quieter at dinner, his eyes somewhere else even when I was talking. I told myself it was normal, new fatherhood fear, financial pressure, the weight of providing for a family. But what I didn't know that day, and for many days after, was that the man sitting across from me at the table was already halfway out the door of our marriage, and I was the last person to find out. Ethan was born on a Tuesday morning in October. David held him in the hospital room, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw the man I fell in love with again. He kissed my forehead and said, "We're really doing this. We're really a family now." I believed him completely. 6 months later, he was dead. Or so I thought. The story I was told was simple and terrible in the way real tragedies often are. A late night at the office. A drive home on a rain-soaked highway. A guardrail, a ravine, a car that caught fire before anyone could reach him. The police said there wasn't much left to identify, that they confirmed it was him through his wallet, his wedding ring, dental records his family provided. I didn't ask many questions. Grief doesn't leave much room for questions. Grief just leaves room for grief. I remember the funeral like it happened underwater, sounds distorted, faces blurred, everything moving too slowly and too fast at once. David's mother could barely stand. His sister, Rachel, held my hand through the entire service, her fingers cold and shaking just like mine. Our closest family friend, a man named Marcus who had known David since childhood, gave the eulogy because I could not form words that day. He spoke about David's laugh, his loyalty, the way he'd have given anyone the coat off his back. Everyone cried. I cried the hardest because I was holding a baby who would never know his father's voice, only stories about him. For the first year after, I existed rather than lived. I went through the motions, feeding Ethan, changing him, teaching my classes, coming home to an apartment that echoed with silence. Grief has a strange shape. Some days it sat on my chest like a stone. Other days, it hid, and I'd catch myself laughing at something on television before the guilt crashed back in, reminding me I wasn't supposed to feel okay. But I had Ethan. And Ethan needed a mother who could stand upright, even if her knees were shaking. So I stood. Rachel, David's sister, became my closest support in those years. She'd come over on weekends, help with Ethan, sit with me on nights when the loneliness felt too heavy to carry alone. Marcus, too, stayed close. He'd fix things around the apartment, check on us, tell Ethan stories about the father he'd never met. I was grateful. I told myself I was lucky, that even in losing David, I hadn't lost everyone who loved him. Slowly, painfully, I rebuilt something that resembled a life. I got a small promotion at school, became head of the second-grade department. I moved into a modest house with a backyard, something David and I had always talked about for someday. I planted a garden. I let Ethan grow up surrounded by pictures of his father on the mantelpiece, told him bedtime stories about a man who loved fishing and terrible jokes and the sound of rain. By the time Ethan turned 8, I had convinced myself that the wound had closed, even if the scar never fully faded. I had found something like peace. I want you to remember that feeling, that fragile, hard-won peace, because I am about to tell you how it shattered in the space of 4 words. It was a Saturday. Ordinary in every way a day can be ordinary. I took Ethan grocery shopping, the two of us arguing lightly over whether cereal with too much sugar counted as an acceptable breakfast. He was pushing the small cart the store gave to kids, weaving it between displays, chattering about a video game he wanted for his birthday. I wasn't paying full attention, the way you don't, when a moment feels like every other moment you've lived 1,000 times before. We turned into the frozen food aisle, and Ethan stopped walking. I noticed the silence before I noticed anything else. My son, who never stopped talking, had gone completely still, his small cart abandoned in the middle of the aisle. I turned to see what caught his attention and found him staring at a man standing by the freezer doors on the opposite end, a basket in his hand, glancing at the label of a frozen pizza box. At first, I felt nothing but mild confusion. Just a stranger buying groceries, like anyone else on a Saturday afternoon. Then Ethan's voice broke the air like glass hitting tile. "Mom." His voice was barely a whisper, and then it wasn't a whisper anymore. "Mom, that's Dad." I laughed, a short, nervous, reflexive sound, the kind you make when your brain hasn't caught up to what your ears just heard. "Sweetheart, that's not." But Ethan wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the man, his small hands trembling at his sides, his face pale in a way I had never seen on my son before. Not once, not even during nightmares or fevers or the time he broke his arm falling off his bike. "Mom, I know his face. I've seen his pictures every day. That's Dad." I turned to really look this time. Truly look. And the ground beneath me tilted. The man was taller than I remembered, his hair shorter, a beard where there used to be none. But something about the way he stood, weight shifted to one leg, head slightly tilted as he read the nutrition label, was so achingly, impossibly familiar that my chest seized before my mind could even process why. He looked up, and our eyes met across the frozen food aisle of a grocery store on an ordinary Saturday afternoon, 8 years after I had watched his casket lowered into the ground. I want to tell you I screamed. I want to tell you I ran to him, demanded answers, collapsed into a heap of fury and heartbreak right there on the tile floor. But that is not what happened. What happened was silence, a long, suspended silence in which the entire store seemed to hold its breath alongside me. The man's face went through something complicated, something I would spend the following weeks trying to decode. Shock, yes, but also something that looked disturbingly like fear. And beneath the fear, something worse. Recognition. Not just of me, of himself. As if seeing me, seeing Ethan, had confirmed something he had spent 8 years trying to bury deeper than any coffin ever could. He set down the basket. And he walked away, fast, weaving through the aisles toward the exit, not running exactly, but close enough that I understood, in the animal part of my brain that understands things before words catch up, that he was fleeing. I didn't chase him. I couldn't. My legs had turned to something other than muscle and bone. I stood there in the frozen food aisle, my son's hand gripping mine so tightly it hurt, both of us staring at the sliding doors where a dead man had just walked out into the parking lot, alive, breathing, and running from us like we were the danger. "Mom," Ethan said again, quieter now, confused rather than certain. "Was that really Dad?" I didn't have an answer. Not one I could say out loud. Because somewhere beneath the shock, beneath the ringing in my ears, a terrible clarity was beginning to form. If that man was David, and every cell in my body was screaming that it was, then everything I had believed for 8 years was a lie. The funeral, the grief, the casket I had wept over, the story of the crash, the fire, the identification through dental records. All of it. And if it was a lie, someone had built it. Someone had helped him disappear. Someone had let me raise our son believing his father was dead, when he was somewhere out there, alive, buying frozen pizza on a Saturday afternoon like nothing had ever happened. I drove home in silence that day, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, Ethan quiet in the back seat, both of us shattered by the same 4 words in different ways. He had seen a ghost. I had seen a lie walk on 2 legs. But what neither of us knew yet, what I would only discover in the weeks that followed, was how deep that lie went, how many people I trusted had helped bury it alongside an empty casket, and how far I would have to go to dig up the truth. That Saturday in the frozen food aisle wasn't the end of my grief. It was only the beginning of my reckoning. For 3 days after the grocery store, I told myself I had imagined it. Grief plays tricks, I reasoned. Maybe it was a stranger who resembled David enough to fool a traumatized woman and a boy who'd only ever known his father through photographs. Maybe my mind, worn down by years of quiet mourning, had finally cracked under some invisible pressure and shown me exactly what a wounded heart wanted to see. But Ethan didn't let me believe that lie for long. "I know it was him, Mom," he said on the 3rd night, sitting cross-legged on his bed, arms wrapped around his knees. I know his voice from the video. The one where he's laughing at your birthday. It's the same laugh. I heard it in my head all day at school. There was a video, one of the only ones I had left of David, filmed on an old phone at my 28th birthday, of him laughing so hard at his own joke that he nearly knocked over a cake. Ethan had watched that video more times than I could count, memorizing his father in fragments the way children do when a person exists to them only as an idea. I sat beside my son that night, and instead of comforting him with a lie, I made a decision that would change everything that came after. "I believe you," I said. I saw him too. Something in Ethan's shoulders loosened, like a child who has been carrying an impossible weight and finally set part of it down. But in me, something else began, a slow, cold burn that would take weeks to fully catch fire. Because believing him meant I had to ask the question I had spent 8 years avoiding. Who had helped David fake his death? And why? I started with the only records I had, the accident report, filed away in a folder I hadn't opened since the year Ethan was born. I read it again with new eyes, the eyes of a woman who no longer trusted the story she'd been told. The report was thin, suspiciously thin, now that I was looking for gaps instead of glossing over them in grief. A single responding officer. A vehicle burned beyond typical recognition, yet somehow with the wallet intact enough to identify the driver. Dental records confirmed by a private dentist's office 2 towns over, one David had never mentioned visiting. I remembered, faintly, that it had been Marcus, David's closest friend since childhood, who handled most of the funeral arrangements. I had been too broken to manage details, and he had stepped in without me even having to ask, coordinating with the funeral home, speaking to the insurance company on my behalf, gathering paperwork I was too numb to read. At the time, I called it kindness. Now, I called it something else. Access. I remembered too, with a chill crawling up my spine, that David had taken out a substantial life insurance policy only 4 months before Ethan was born, a policy far larger than our modest income would typically justify. One he had insisted on despite my gentle pushback that it seemed excessive. "Better safe than sorry," he'd said, kissing my forehead the way he always did when he wanted a conversation to end. I had received that payout roughly 6 months after his death. It had helped me buy the house. It had helped me survive the years I couldn't imagine surviving. I had thought it was his final gift to us. Now I understood it might have been the final piece of an exit plan. I didn't confront anyone yet. I wasn't ready, and more importantly, I wasn't foolish enough to walk into a fire without understanding its shape first. Instead, I did something I had never done in my life. I hired a private investigator. His name was Daniel Reyes, a quiet, methodical man in his 50s who had spent 2 decades in law enforcement before going private. I sat across from him in his small office and told him everything: the grocery store, my son's certainty, the thin accident report, the insurance payout, the friend who had handled everything while I was too broken to ask questions. "If your husband is alive," Daniel said carefully, "someone helped him disappear. Faking a death this convincingly isn't something one person does alone. There's a body somewhere in that story, whether it's a real body used to fool identification, or a paid-off official, or both. And there's usually a paper trail, even when people think they've covered it." It took him 11 days to find the first thread. The dental records used to confirm David's identity had come from a small private practice that had closed permanently 4 years ago, its former owner now unreachable, having moved out of the country under circumstances Daniel described only as financially complicated. Convenient, in the way that only a carefully constructed lie is convenient. The second thread came from something I never expected: Rachel. David's sister, the woman who had held my hand through his funeral, who had spent years helping me raise Ethan on weekends, who I had trusted so completely that I never once considered her name as anything but family. Daniel found a wire transfer from an offshore account, sent roughly 1 month after David's supposed death, into an account under Rachel's maiden name. The amount was substantial, far more than any grieving sister should have received from her brother's meager estate. I remember sitting in my car outside Daniel's office after he told me this, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, unable to decide whether I wanted to scream or simply stop breathing altogether. Rachel. The woman who had sat beside me at every school recital, every birthday party, every moment I thought I was raising my son with the supportive family who genuinely loved us. She had known. She had known this entire time, and she had let me grieve a man who was alive, let me raise his son believing his father chose death over abandonment, when the truth was so much simpler and so much crueler. He had chosen to leave, and she had helped him do it. But what I didn't know that day, what I would only discover a week later, in the conversation that broke something in me I didn't know could still break, was the reason why. I confronted Rachel on a Tuesday evening in my kitchen after Ethan had gone to bed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply placed the bank transfer documents on the table between us and watched the color drain from her face. "Tell me the truth," I said. "All of it. Or I go to the police tonight." Rachel's hands trembled as she reached for the papers. Though she didn't need to read them, she already knew what they said. For a long moment, she said nothing, and I watched 8 years of carefully maintained grief crack across her features like a dam giving way. "He was in trouble," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Real trouble. Money he owed to people who don't send polite reminders. He came to me terrified, said if he didn't disappear, they'd come after you and Ethan too. He said faking his death was the only way to protect you both, clear the debt with the insurance money, disappear before they connected him to you, start over somewhere they'd never look." "And you believed that was protecting us?" My voice cracked despite my best effort to keep it steady. "You let me bury an empty casket, Rachel. You let my son grow up believing his father was dead. You took money to help him vanish and left me to pick up every piece he shattered." "I didn't know what else to do," she said, tears finally falling. "He was my brother. And he swore it was temporary, a year, maybe 2, until the debt collectors lost interest and moved on. He swore he'd come back for you both once it was safe. That was 8 years ago." My voice had gone cold now, flat in a way that frightened even me. 8 years, Rachel. He didn't come back because it stopped being about debt collectors a long time ago, didn't it? Tell me the rest. Because I already suspected what she was avoiding. Daniel's investigation had turned up more than just the wire transfer. It had turned up a name, a woman named Patricia, living 3 states away, married to a man using the name David Whitfield. Married for 6 years. With 2 children under the age of 5. Rachel's silence confirmed everything. David hadn't just disappeared to escape debt. He had disappeared to build an entirely new life, a new wife who didn't know she was married to a dead man, new children who had no idea their father had another family grieving him 3 states away. The debt story might have been true at first. But somewhere along the way, David had simply decided that starting over meant erasing us entirely, and everyone who claimed to love us had chosen to help him do it. I didn't cry in front of Rachel that night. I saved that for later, alone in my bedroom, the door locked, my hand pressed over my mouth so Ethan wouldn't wake to the sound of his mother finally, fully breaking. I grieved that night in a way I hadn't allowed myself to grieve at the funeral 8 years earlier, not for a man who had died, but for a woman who had spent nearly a decade of her life mourning a lie. I grieved the years I had spent alone in a bed meant for 2 people. I grieved every bedtime story I had told Ethan about a father who supposedly loved us so much that death couldn't keep him from watching over us, when the truth was he had simply chosen not to come back. But grief, I had learned once already in my life, does not stay in one shape forever. By morning, something had shifted in me. The devastation was still there, but underneath it, something harder had begun to form. Not just anger. Resolve. David had built an elaborate lie to escape the consequences of his choices. He had let his sister and best friend construct a fiction so convincing that a grieving widow and a fatherless child spent 8 years honoring a grave that held nothing but an empty box and someone else's ashes. He thought he had gotten away with it. He didn't know that his own son's memory, a small boy clutching a phone screen, replaying his father's laugh until he'd know it anywhere, had just brought the entire lie crashing down. And he certainly didn't know what I was about to do next. Truth, once you find it, has a way of demanding to be spoken aloud. I could have let David disappear back into whatever shadow he'd built his second life inside. I could have taken the documents Daniel had gathered, filed them away, and quietly moved forward, protecting Ethan from the ugliness of it all. Part of me, the tired part, the part still raw from years of grieving a lie, wanted exactly that. To simply walk away and let David live with whatever version of himself he'd created. But every time I looked at my son, I thought about Patricia. A woman 3 states away, raising 2 children with a man she believed was entirely hers, entirely honest, entirely real. She was living inside the same kind of lie I had lived inside for 8 years, except she didn't even know a lie existed. And somewhere in me, a stubborn, unshakable conviction took root. I would not let another family be built on a foundation of deception, not when I had the power to stop it. So I decided. Not revenge in the way movies show it, no dramatic confrontations, no public humiliation staged for spectacle. My revenge would be truth. Cold, documented, undeniable truth, delivered to every place David had tried to bury it. Daniel helped me compile everything: the falsified dental records, the wire transfer to Rachel, the marriage certificate under the alias David Whitfield, insurance fraud spanning 8 years, and a payout obtained under false pretenses. It was, Daniel told me plainly, more than enough for federal charges. Insurance fraud alone carried significant prison time. Bigamy, in the state where Patricia lived, added its own layer of consequence. And underneath all of it sat the quiet, devastating cruelty of what he'd done to a child who had spent his entire life believing his father was a hero taken too soon, rather than a man who simply chose to leave. I made 2 calls before I made any others. The first was to the insurance company that had paid out David's policy 8 years earlier. I explained everything, provided the documentation Daniel had gathered, and within a week, their fraud investigation division confirmed what I already knew. The death had been staged, and the payout had been obtained illegally. They opened a formal case and referred it to federal authorities, given the scope of the deception. The second call was harder. I called Patricia. I sat with that decision for 3 full days before I made it, agonizing over whether I had any right to shatter a stranger's life the way mine had just been shattered. But I kept returning to the same truth: she deserved to know. Whatever pain the knowledge caused her now was smaller than the pain of building years more of her life on a lie she never consented to. She answered on the third ring, her voice warm and unsuspecting, the voice of a woman who had no idea her entire world was about to tilt on its axis the same way mine had in a frozen food aisle. I introduced myself as gently as I could, though there was no gentle way to say what came next. I told her my name was Claire. I told her I had been married to a man named David for 6 years before he disappeared 8 years ago, presumed dead in a car accident that insurance investigators now believed was staged. I told her I had a 9-year-old son who had spotted his supposedly dead father in a grocery store 3 weeks earlier. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. "That's not possible," she finally said, her voice hollow. "David's parents live 2 states over. I've met them. We visit every Christmas." "Rachel and their mother," I said quietly. "They helped him disappear. They knew the whole time." I heard her breath catch, then break into something that sounded like the beginning of the same grief I had felt days earlier, not for a death, but for a life built on sand. We spent nearly 2 hours on that call, 2 women who had never met, bound together by a man who had systematically deceived us both, comparing timelines, comparing lies, slowly assembling the full and horrifying shape of what David had built and how carefully he had kept his 2 lives from ever touching. Patricia, I learned, had married David under his assumed name 6 years ago, roughly 2 years after he vanished from my life. She had no idea her marriage wasn't legally valid, no idea her husband had another wife who had never divorced him, because he had never actually died, only disappeared. Her children, 5 and 3, had a father who was, in the eyes of the law, still married to someone else, still legally bound to a family he'd let believe him dead. By the end of that call, Patricia had made her own decision. She would not protect him either. 2 weeks later, federal investigators, working alongside local authorities in the state where Patricia lived, arrested David at the small logistics company where he'd been working under his assumed name. Daniel later told me the arrest happened quietly, in a parking lot, no dramatic scene, no chase, just a man finally caught by the weight of everything he thought he'd successfully buried. I did not go to the arrest. I did not need to see it to feel the shift inside me, the slow exhale of 8 years of grief finally finding somewhere to land besides my own chest. The trial came 5 months later. I sat in the courtroom on the second day, close enough to see David clearly for the first time since the grocery store. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in some essential way, as though the years of hiding had worn something out of him that could never be replaced. When our eyes met across the room, he didn't look away this time. He simply looked broken, the way a man looks when he finally understands there is no version of the story where he escapes what he built. He was convicted on multiple counts: insurance fraud, identity fraud, bigamy. The judge, in sentencing, spoke directly about the emotional damage inflicted not just on 2 wives, but on children who had been used, unknowingly, as pawns in an elaborate deception. He received a sentence of 9 years, with the possibility of reduced time for good behavior. It would not undo 8 years of stolen grief. But it was finally consequence, real, undeniable, unavoidable consequence, the thing David had spent nearly a decade running from. Rachel faced her own consequences, though lesser ones. She cooperated fully once the investigation began, and her sentence reflected that cooperation, though our relationship never recovered. I have not spoken to her since the trial ended. Some betrayals, I've learned, cannot simply be forgiven because the person asks nicely enough or cries hard enough. Some betrayals require distance, permanent and complete, in order for real healing to begin. As for Ethan, my brave, sharp-eyed son, the boy who had recognized his father's laugh from a single video watched 100 times, I sat him down after the trial concluded and explained everything in words gentle enough for a 9-year-old to hold, but honest enough that he would never again feel like the truth had been kept from him. "Your dad made choices that hurt a lot of people," I told him. "But none of that is because of anything you did or anything wrong with you. You were the reason the truth came out at all. You were braver than any adult in this story, including me." He cried that night, not for the father he'd lost twice now, but for the version of his father he'd carried in his heart for years, the hero, the man in the video laughing at his own joke, the man he'd built entire daydreams around. I let him grieve that version fully, because he deserved to mourn it properly before letting it go. It has been almost a year now since that Saturday in the frozen food aisle. Ethan is doing well, thriving, actually, in the way children often surprise us by doing once the weight of an unspoken lie is finally lifted from their shoulders. He asks questions sometimes, hard ones, about trust and forgiveness and whether people can truly change. I answer them as honestly as I can, because I promised myself, standing at an empty grave 8 years ago, that I would raise him to be a good man. I intend to keep that promise, even if the path to keeping it looked nothing like I expected. As for me, I've found something I didn't expect to find in the wreckage of all this. Not closure exactly, because I'm not sure closure is a real, achievable thing after a betrayal this deep. What I found instead was clarity. A hard, sharp-edged understanding that the version of my life I mourned for 8 years was never actually mine to mourn, because it was never real to begin with. What is real is the family I built afterward, brick by brick, out of grief and grocery store epiphanies and courtroom testimonies and long nights explaining hard truths to a 9-year-old boy who deserved so much better than the lie he was born into. If there is a lesson in all of this, and I believe there is, because I refuse to let 8 stolen years mean nothing, it is this: the truth does not stay buried forever, no matter how carefully someone constructs the grave. It waits. Sometimes for years. Sometimes it waits for something as small and unexpected as a child's memory of a laugh, replayed 100 times on an old phone screen, until the day it finally recognizes the man standing in a grocery store aisle and refuses to stay silent. I did not choose the lie that shaped the first 8 years of my son's life. But I chose what came after. I chose truth over comfortable silence. I chose to protect a stranger from the same deception I had suffered, even though it would have been easier to walk away. And I chose to raise my son not as a victim of his father's choices, but as living proof that even the most carefully built lies eventually meet a version of the truth they cannot outrun. We are healing. Not perfectly, not without hard days, but honestly, which is more than I can say for the 8 years that came before. And that, I've come to believe, is its own kind of justice.